Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our Thursday panels and keynote. We're starting with the keynote this morning. And first, I will acknowledge that we are Zooming to you from unceded, unsurrendered, traditional Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. And today is the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Day, which reminds us of our responsibilities to address past injustices and to engage with respect in a better common future. To this audience, I will remind us that the Indigenous knowledge around the world has been undervalued and is likely key to the survival of humans on the planet. Today, we're starting with a keynote by speaker Rache Bezner Kerr on adaptation, food security, and the challenge of financing adaptation in Africa. So you will see that it brings together two of our main themes in the conference. And then in the afternoon, starting at 1, there's finance and sustainable climate adaptation. And that is basically, where is the money? So thank you very much for attending, and we hope you have a great day. Thank you. Bye.
Hello, everyone. My name is Roy Culpeper. I'm the chair of the group of 78, and it's my honor and pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for this morning. Rache Bezner Kerr is a professor of global development at Cornell University with a background in sociology, environmental science, and international development. She does long-term research in Malawi and Tanzania, using participatory research methods to test the impacts of the agroecological approaches on livelihoods, nutrition, and sustainable land management for rural communities. She's published over 70 peer-reviewed publications, book chapters, and books in scientific journals such as Agriculture, Ecosystems and Environment, Agriculture, Human Values, and other such journals. She co-authored a report for the United Nations high-level panel of experts which examined the potential for agroecology, which I'm sure she's going to explain in depth, to address food security and nutrition. She currently serves as a coordinating lead author for the chapter on climate change impacts and adaptation of food systems for the next Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, report. Rache has 4 major areas of research. 1, historical, political, and social roots of the food system in northern Malawi. 2, sustainable agriculture, food security, and social processes in rural Africa. 3, social relations linked to health and nutritional outcomes. And 4, local knowledge and climate change adaptation. Under her leadership, she directs the Bezner Kerr Lab, an interdisciplinary group of researchers which spans a number of subjects: agroecology, food security, health, and nutrition, among others. Many of our speakers have stressed the importance of intersectionality when trying to understand adaptation and how to build resilience. It is quite clear that Rache brings a multifaceted lens to her work. Last but certainly not least, I'm happy to mention that Rache is a Canadian. She obtained her bachelor's degree at the University of Toronto and her master's at Guelph University before receiving her doctorate at Cornell. Rache is going to speak about agroecological approaches to climate change adaptation. Please note, she cannot speak on behalf of the current report that she is working on as an IPCC author on climate change impacts and adaptation of food systems, as it is not due to be released until next year. But she can provide an overview of some of the key findings from previous IPCC reports. Rache, a warm welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thanks very much for that lovely introduction. And can you hear me okay, Roy, before you disappear? Okay, great. So thank you. And I'm really pleased to be here virtually, if not in person. And I am hoping to talk for not too long so that there's enough time for questions and discussion, because I think that's where you can have some of the most fruitful points of learning and exchange. And I'm currently abroad, so I apologize if the sound is not great. But nonetheless, Roy mentioned that I was going to focus my talk on agroecology. And one of the reasons is because it has gotten less attention in the global arena. But I want to start by reviewing what many of you already know, and that is the role that climate change plays in impacting the food systems globally. And we know from the special report on land that the IPCC put out in 2014, as well as the report on oceans and the cryosphere, is that climate change is having dramatic impacts on food systems, including an increased frequency of extremes such as droughts and floods, that in turn not only affect total production, but also affect the diversity of foods available to local communities and drive up local food prices. Alongside that, we see ocean acidification and warming having negative impacts on fisheries, particularly in tropical regions, but it's quite variable around the world. And there have been some fisheries in places like Australia that have collapsed entirely, or fish move from one place to another. So in either case, it has dramatic impacts on local fish availability. And then in addition, we see warming increasing land degradation and ecosystem health. So the special report on land really highlighted the ways in which land is under pressure from a combination of human activity and climate change. So with climate change, you see this extreme weather, rising temperatures, changing rainfall patterns, damaging land quality. But also the way we grow food and the kinds of food we eat have dramatic impacts on the food, on land degradation. So we have a sort of industrial model for much of our food production that involves intensification of the use of synthetic inputs like fertilizer and pesticides, as well as mechanization, and in part to produce livestock feed because of rising consumption of livestock feed, but also highly processed foods that take a lot of energy. And this has impacts not only on land degradation and ecosystem services like pollination and water quality, but also threatens wetlands and has impacts on fisheries and other wildlife in aquatic systems. And this, our food system has dramatic impacts on deforestation, which then leads to this kind of negative role that agriculture has on greenhouse gas emissions. So it's not only in terms of deforestation, which increases greenhouse gas emissions, but also the use of things like fertilizer and pesticides, which themselves are require a lot of fossil fuels to produce and to apply. And all of this has impact on the Earth system. With IPBES, the International Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystems, stating in their recent report that agriculture is one of the Earth's biggest threats and is linked to dramatic declines in biodiversity globally. That has been deemed one of our global crises alongside climate change. So we have a real paradox, because on the one hand, the world produces more than 3 times the amount of food that people need to feed the global human population. But some of the very same producers that are producing our food are themselves food insecure. So although we have industrial food production, we also have a lot of people who are growing food in smallholders, and they actually produce the majority of food consumed in Asia, Latin America, and Africa, including the majority of diverse food types, so vegetables, fruits, roots, and tubers in these regions, while sustaining agrobiodiversity and being stewards of the land. They also experience high levels of food insecurity. More, in fact, they're at greater risk of food insecurity than urban dwellers. And we've seen the rates of food insecurity globally actually rise in the last 7 years after many years of
We appear to have lost Rachel.
you can't. Can you hear me now?
We just missed about a minute or so at most.
The background noise has disappeared now, so I can take my headset off.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry about that. So I was just talking about how, in addition to having over 800 million people experiencing food insecurity, we also have over 2 billion people who are overnourished. So we have a highly unequal system, and we have a system that is highly concentrated. So a very few number of companies, large foreign multinational companies, are those that sell the inputs within this system, the seeds, the fertilizer, the pesticides, the tractors, and a very few number of retail outlets, a very few number of companies that sell the vast majority of food products globally. And that means they have a lot of, they hold a lot of the cards in controlling the current food system. So it's highly unequal in terms of having a voice and having a say in the current food system. And that's a big part of the challenge we have, because the current big players also benefit from the system. They profit the most from the system, despite these instabilities and these inequities within the food system. And so that means they have the most to lose if we want to change that food system. So there are some moving back to thinking about, that's kind of an overall picture of the food system, moving back to thinking about how to address climate change adaptation in Africa. There are kind of two contrasting approaches that link to this, sort of contrasting types of food systems and food production in globally. And the dominant paradigm is really sustainable intensification, which tends to focus on productivity and rely on fossil fuel-based inputs, such as synthetic fertilizer and pesticides. It also tends to be quite expert-driven. And so the solutions lie in technical solutions, expert-driven, and capital-intensive. And so you need money, and you need the experts to tell you what to do with this vision of solutions for climate change adaptation. And the political and social dimensions of a hunger are really absent in terms of ways to address climate change adaptation. And in contrast, and this is really the approach that I've been involved with and been testing for the last 20 odd years, is agroecology, which is considered a science, a set of practices, and social movements. And including in Africa, we have the African Food Sovereignty Alliance, which represents over 200 million smallholders around the continent. And agroecology advocates diversification of species, maximizing kind of synergies and biological control, and minimizing the use of external inputs, and recycling of resources, including energy and organic matter, but also pays a lot of attention to the use of farmer knowledge, drawing on indigenous knowledge, and farmer experimentation, as well as social and political dimensions of food. So it's really a very contrasting approach to climate change adaptation. And in our report that I co-authored with the United Nations Committee for world food security on agroecology, we reviewed the literature and identified these 13 principles, which are embedded in an agroecological approach. And on the left of this diagram, we have the kind of different levels of transitioning to a sustainable food system that scientists such as Steve Gleesman and others have argued that agroecology takes. And at the lower level, you have things like transitioning away from the use of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides and replacing those with organic material, and increasing efficiency of the system. So these draw on principles like building soil health and reducing external fossil fuel-based inputs. And then as you move towards more of a farm level design of your agroecological farm, you build in a lot more biodiversity and synergies between different parts of the system. So integrating livestock and animals and trees into your system, paying attention to animal health and welfare. But then as you move away from the farm into more regional and into more regional systems and trying to transition into a more sustainable regional food system, there's attention to social, economic, and political dimensions of the food system. So things like participation in the governance of the food system, building connectivity between producers and consumers, ensuring fairness of the food system, in both for producers and consumers, and attention to social values and diets. And at the heart of an agroecological approach is really this co-creation of knowledge. So farmers working with scientists to produce knowledge that is relevant for the particular social and economic and ecological context. So that was a lot of information for one slide. There was a review that was done this past year by a number of scientists, including Siglinde Snap at Michigan State University and others, and they reviewed the literature to look for evidence for agroecology as both a source of adaptation and mitigation. And they found significant evidence for both of those, particularly as a source of adaptation, including things like building soil health, ensuring pollination and pest regulation services, and providing local adaptation solutions. In terms of mitigation, they highlighted agroforestry as a particularly, as there being robust evidence for agroforestry increasing carbon sequestration in biomass and in the soil. And this photograph is an agroforestry system in Malawi, where you have trees and crops grown together. You can have agroforestry systems that involve livestock as well, called silvopastoral systems. There was also evidence of organic farming as a form of mitigation, although most of the evidence was found in the global north, not in the global south, because of data limitations, limited studies in the global south. In terms of adaptation strategies, a really core approach for agroecological approaches as an adaptation strategy is through diversification of production, having more varieties, having more species, both plants and animals incorporated into a farming system. And this allows to build up things such as core ecosystem services such as pollination. It builds up soil organic carbon. It can improve water quality. And it also increases resilience in case of extreme events. So for example, if you have drought, you may get some crop failure of one particular type of crop, but not another. You may be able to withstand pest outbreaks if you have a wider range of crops and animals that you're growing. And it has benefits in terms of reducing risk for farmers in terms of livelihoods and providing multiple benefits such as shade, fodder, and so on. And there's a a very robust evidence base that diversified production is an important strategy for climate change adaptation. And that's what this report said, but there have been other meta reviews really supporting this perspective. One of the ways that agroecology helps to be a form of climate change adaptation is in this very strong attention to how knowledge is developed for climate change adaptation. So a range of participatory approaches that also address inequities in the food system. So things like farmer-to-farmer exchanges, farmer experimentation, drawing on Indigenous knowledge are common components for programs to really bring ecology to scale, but also ensure that they are adapted to and relevant to the local agroecosystem and local socioeconomic context. In addition to this kind of co-learning or co-production of knowledge, you also have in an agroecological approach this deep attention to social inequities in the food system and need for democratic governance in the food system. And this can be at the household scale, so gender inequities, addressing gender inequities within households, at the community level, ensuring people who have lower access to land are able to access that land, be it low-income households or particular ethnic groups or people who have migrated from other regions. And at the national and international scale in terms of regions that have less access to resources or have less access to information that may prevent them from trying to transition to sustainable food systems. So it began a review as part of the Committee for World Food Security UN report on agroecology, looking at the evidence for agroecology having impact on food security and nutrition, because it's a common concern expressed that if you transition to an agroecological system, you will not be able to address food security and nutrition. And in our screening of the evidence, we found that the majority of studies that looked at this question found evidence that agroecological approaches led to positive impacts on food security and nutrition. And in particular, those that had more complex agroecological systems. So not just one strategy, one technique like agroforestry, but combining multiple strategies, crop diversification, integration of livestock and animals, livestock and crops, for example, and farmer networks and addressing social inequalities in the food system. These were more likely to lead to positive food security outcomes. And this is my one slide on the money. The report by Snap et al. Looked at the current financial picture, how much money in adaptation is going towards an agroecological approach. And they found that this is for the EU, but similar studies have been done in the United States. And I don't think a study like this has been done for Canadian development funding. But in the case of the EU, they found about 80% of projects were not supportive of this approach to climate change adaptation, and 10% were partially supported. And if you want to look into the details, I can give you the link for how they assess that. And 10% were supportive. So about 10% of current sort of development and climate change adaptation funding goes towards this kind of approach in agriculture. So I wanted to go over some examples from my own research that I've been involved with primarily in Malawi, but also in Tanzania. And we've worked with a range of these are different studies that I'm showing here. One study that explicitly selected highly food insecure households in 20 villages, 400 households, and did a pre-post design where they got training on agroecology and then we studied change over time, to a study with 6,000 households. This study was actually funded by the government of Canada, where we looked at pre-post and compared control and intervention households who got training in agroecology. And attention to gender and other social inequalities, I should add, as part of that training. And then we had a sort of sister project in Tanzania where we did a both pre, post, and control intervention with 588 households. In all of these studies, agroecological practices significantly increased food security and dietary diversity after controlling for other factors that affect food security and dietary diversity. So this isn't just an association, but a multivariate analysis. And particular practices we found to be significant were crop diversification and compost application, as well as participation in the agroecology project itself. Another important method in Tanzania was intercropping, which increased with the agroecological intervention. And in Tanzania, we also found, both in Tanzania and in Malawi, this slide shows the Tanzania number, but we found an increase in child dietary diversity for households that were undertaking these agroecological practices. And we also found with each additional food crop grown, the likelihood of becoming food secure was greater in these studies. And there were multiple pathways that people achieved food security. It could be that they had to apply less labor and they could use that labor in other ways. They could be direct consumption, so they're growing a greater range of food and growing more food, and that led to greater food security. In some cases, they saved money from the previously purchased inputs because they were adding organic matter to the soil instead of purchased fertilizer. And they used that savings to invest in other things, such as animals or invest in dry season vegetable gardens. And they reported significantly higher but modest farm income changes. So more than double what they had previously earned, but extremely low incomes from farm income. And they also no longer had to work on other people's farms at the height of the hungry season. So typically in Malawi, when people run out of their own food source, they have to go and work on other people's farms during the growing season and are often only paid in flour, actually, rather than paid in cash. And when they became more food secure, they produced more food from using these agroecological practices, they were able to invest in their own farm during that time period. So they got more benefits from that investment. So adding compost or adding crop residue to the soil, and then they were getting better maize yield and greater diversity of crops. And they invested some of that time in dry season vegetable gardens. But we also found that the community benefited from this approach because there was more food sharing and seed sharing in communities that were using this intervention. And so there was kind of a all boats rising from the benefit. I don't remember the exact metaphor, but it wasn't just individual households that were benefiting. And it wasn't just individuals within those households. So we had this emphasis on attention to gender inequities within households as part of these interventions. And we found that that had significant impact on food security. So in Malawi, for example, one study, we found that those farmers who began to discuss farming and share decision-making about farming with their spouses were 2.4 times more likely at the end of the intervention to be food secure and have diverse diets compared to those who did not discuss farming. Interestingly, at the beginning of the intervention, we found only 10% of farmers reported, both men and women, reported discussing farming and discussing decision-making about farming with their spouse. In Tanzania, we measured the incidence of probable depression, and we found very high rates at the beginning of the study, and we found a significant decline in probable depression for women at the end of the study, which we found was linked both to improvements in food security and to changes in gender equity. And specifically, we found a significant increase in men helping with household tasks in this study. So it wasn't just improvements in terms of food security and diets, but also in terms of gender relations within the home that was making a difference. And we've looked at whether these practices can be sustained. One of the things we looked at is what's the likelihood of a household in this 5-year study we did with 6,000 farming households. We looked at the likelihood of a farming household transitioning from food insecurity to food security. And we found that with each agroecological practice they added, they were more likely to make that transition during that time frame. So more complex agroecological systems increase the likelihood of them transitioning. And we also found farmers were participating in these farmer to farmer learning practices were significantly more likely to practice a range of different agroecological methods. And so this farmer to farmer exchange and farmer experimentation was a big piece to why farmers took up these practices. And we did a study recently where we went back to households who had received training over 3 years ago to see whether, and 2 years after the intervention actually ended, to see if they were still using the practices, and 90% were still using the agroecological practices that they had taken up. So overall, this approach to climate change adaptation using agroecology really incorporates this attention to participatory learning methods and is context specific, so adapted to a given agroecosystem and socio-political context, and emphasizes diversity of knowledge systems and this kind of co-learning strategy, as well as biodiversity, as really core to climate change adaptation. And it's holistic. So it's not just looking at the production system, but really looking at the social and economic system beyond the farm. And I haven't talked about this now, but in order to really see climate change adaptation long-term, you need to address broader social inequalities. Agroecology alone isn't going to fix the situation because of enduring inequities in land access, issues around the right to save seeds, for example, and other questions around governance of food systems. And then the need to really have very significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions if we're not going to see the kind of extreme impacts on food systems in places like Africa from climate change. And in addition, the kind of structuring of the food system more generally in the current global context really works against building local economies with agricultural systems. And so that's another kind of gap that needs addressing if this strategy is going to work. So with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen and open it up for questions.
Rachel, thank you so much for that rich and in-depth introduction for many people to agroecology and its manifold benefits. Let me just start off. There are a couple of questions in the queue, but one of the most striking things I think you said was near the beginning when you said that we're producing 3 times as much food as the world needs. I've never actually come across that figure before, but it puts paid to the contention that you often hear that we need to feed the world, right? There's not enough food. Hunger is a question of not enough food being produced. And that is not the case, simply. It's more a question of distribution and access. Do you want to say something about those issues? Because they lay at the heart of the industrial agricultural system having the power and influence that it has, this feed the world myth.
Yeah, it's a really powerful paradigm, the sort of productivist paradigm, that the problem of food insecurity is really about production. This issue of there being plenty of food to feed people has been true for decades, but the productivist paradigm has really persisted. And, why do people go hungry is not because of lack of production, but really questions of inequity, inequity in access to resources, and not having enough income, and that really has been true for quite some time. So I think it's a hard paradigm to convince when people are convinced that the problem is a question of food production, but the numbers don't bear that out.
Okay, let's go to our Q&A queue. Manfred Bienefeld asked, what are the biggest obstacles to the introduction of agroecological systems in the developing and the developed world?
That's a really good question. I think in the global South, I would say that in some cases it's lack of support for this approach. The dominant industrial paradigm, the sort of focus on intensification, is heavily funded by development organizations and by the private sector. And there is very little support in the development community and in the private sector for an agroecological approach. And so if you have millions of dollars promoting the intensification of fertilizer and pesticides and very little support for an alternative, then I would say that's one of the biggest obstacles. Alongside that is, locally adapted solutions. So it takes time with an agroecological approach to really develop an appropriate strategy. So that requires research, and research that is done using participatory methods. It takes time. So those two go hand in hand. I would say those would be some of the biggest obstacles. And I think that would be true in the global north, but I think in the global north, you have an additional challenge, and this would be true in some parts of the global south, places like Brazil or South Africa, where you have highly unequal division of land, and you have very dominant industrial food producers operating on large tracts of land. Changing that system to an agroecological system will take a lot of political will. And so I think that's a major obstacle. And I think that presents its own particular challenge, which isn't true in all parts of the world.
Okay, the next question is from Sierra Virchillo, who builds on Manfred's question. Thanking you for the presentation, Rachel. I'm wondering if you can address some of the narratives I have heard from Canadian international assistance policymakers that agroecology will not be able to feed cities like Lagos as opposed to just villages, and B, that the Canadian government position is to work with all farmers, not just smallholders. These narratives are used to justify not investing in agroecology, instead opting only for climate-smart farm techniques, practices. Maybe you can expand on that. I appreciate your insights, as my impression is that Canada as a donor has been an obstacle to agroecology abroad.
Nice to hear from Sierra. I have met Sierra before, so thanks for your question. Yes, so this is the political obstacle that I was mentioning. Absolutely, Canada, the US, Australia, I would say, are some of the biggest opponents of agroecology in the kind of political arena in the global scale. So my answer would be that the research that I have reviewed, including modeling done for Europe and modeling done by the FAO, contradicts the claim, and that won't feed cities. An agroecological approach won't feed cities. There was a really interesting study done called 10-year transition for Europe to agroecology or something like that, which demonstrated that, in fact, transitioning to agroecology would feed cities and is viable in the European context. I've seen a similar modeling effort done, published 2 years ago by the FAO, which they didn't use the term agroecology, but in the way they summarized what they were modeling, I think it would fall under that. And they concluded that that would be viable. There have to be other kinds of changes, though, for it to work in the context of the global north. And some of that means shifting diets, which has multiple benefits. We already know that we consume too much, not you particularly, but we in the global north and increasingly in other parts of the world, too much meat and too much highly processed foods, which are very energy intensive and very bad for our health if we consume too many of those products. And so it's going to require political will to make the shift towards a different kind of more diverse diet, which has benefits for health and the environment. And that's part of what will make it more viable. So it's possible, but it's going to require very significant political will for it to happen in a place like Canada.
Rachel, before we go to the next question, may I ask you just to dwell a bit on one of Sierra's point that we can opt only for climate smart farm techniques as opposed to agroecology. Do you want to just expand on the difference between those two approaches?
So climate smart tends to focus on those practices that reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and not necessarily attentive to the ecological impacts from farming practice. They can sometimes align. I mean, it's a broad term and it's used in different ways in different contexts. I would say that agroecological practices are themselves climate smart, because they aim to reduce the use of fossil fuel-based external inputs and be energy efficient. So I don't think that it's necessarily in contrast, but I would say that climate smart practices don't necessarily attend to the kind of ecological or the social and political dimensions that agroecology does.
Okay, thank you. Going on to Irvin Waller, he says you make a compelling case for agroecology. The major challenge in getting action now to achieve the SDGs is intentional efforts to increase awareness and knowledge among the political decision makers. What is being done to educate decision makers about agroecology? Are there studies on the impact of the gender communication around agroecology on reducing violence against women, for example?
So in terms of educating decision makers, there's been a lot of effort from many different groups to educate decision makers about the potential for agroecology. There's a Friends of Agroecology group within the UN, and they were present at the recent UN Food Systems Summit, although there was a lot of challenges with that summit. But nonetheless, there was endorsing of agroecology as an important strategy for climate change adaptation and for the food system at that recent summit. The UN commissioned this report on agroecology, which was written in 2019, and it was endorsed by the Committee for World Food Systems. And in Europe, there's growing support for agroecology, as well as a number of other countries like Senegal, for example, and Sri Lanka, who are members of the Friends of Agroecology group. So there's a lot of growing support for this approach. Although there's also opposition, as I mentioned. And in terms of, are there studies on the impacts of the gender dimension? Yes. Not only I myself have published in that area, but there's a number of studies in Latin America and Europe and Africa around sort of gender dimensions of agroecology. And I wouldn't go so far as to say all agroecology reduces violence against women. That would be way too simplistic or too strong a statement. But an agroecological approach, that is this holistic approach, pays attention to gender inequity and tries to reduce it. And there's some evidence that it does, it can reduce it, and doesn't in all cases, but can.
Okay, I see a long string of really interesting questions coming up, so we'll try and move as briskly as we can. Shane Roberts makes a comment rather than a question, which you can confirm or add to, Rachel. Agroecology moves beyond the old simplistic framing of issues in terms simply of traditional versus industrial agriculture, which is an inadequate dichotomy. Do you agree?
It is. Yeah, you might be interested in looking at the HLP report. We actually have a diagram, sort of how you might think about traditional agriculture, which has, a range. It's diverse in itself. It can be a component of agroecological systems. So I would say it's more complex than how it's often framed, Shane.
Okay, John Van Mossel has weighed in with a couple of comments and questions. John has seen the work you've done, that you've been involved with in northern Malawi, and he can verify what you have presented with his own observations. He says, I'm pleased that agroecology or conservation agriculture is so widespread in southern and eastern Africa. And he's pleased that Canadian NGOs are supporting agroecology programs and systems change. There's opportunity to see what Canadian NGOs are doing in this area. I take that more as a comment than a question. And he adds, grateful if your slideshow can be shared, or at least your literature list. You will share those with us, Rachel?
Happy to.
Okay. Thanks, John.
Thank you for the comment, Lawrence, or Johan.
John. Lawrence Cumming says, many thanks for the excellent presentation. Can you comment on the applicability of agroecology principles and practices with respect to grains production, largely done now as a monoculture on very large farms in Canada and elsewhere? How would we change all this?
Thank you for that question, Lawrence. And I mean, it's not my area of expertise. Almost all my research is in Malawi and Tanzania, but I've had the privilege of working with colleagues at the University of Manitoba. And they have been doing work on this approach with farmers in the prairies. So I think some of what, and I also have, interacted with colleagues here at Cornell who have worked in the United States in sort of similar systems. I think one way is through the incorporation of things like cover crops, and more crop rotation, transitioning to organic production. So I think there's a number of different things like floral strips, which really make a difference in terms of diversity of pollinators. So there are a number of practices which can be applied in the North American context, for which there is some strong scientific research underpinning. And I think it looks different than what it would look like in Malawi, obviously, where you have hand hoeing and very different contexts, but it is still possible and viable.
Okay, John Van Mossel comes back with another point. Canada's new focus on nature-based climate solutions in climate finance provides an opportunity for changing trends in Canada's past support. Would you agree or comment on this? That's
a very good question, one that I've been grappling with. I think nature-based solutions, agroecology could be considered a nature-based solution. The critique of nature-based solutions has been that it's a very broad term. And so who is advocating for it and what does it look like in practice would be the questions to ask. Some very large companies have been advocating for nature-based solutions, and there's been concern in the kind of agriculture and development community that it poses a danger of being a form of greenwashing, if you will, rather than actually getting the food system to no longer be dependent on fossil fuels and really addressing some of these deep inequities within the food system. But as it's broadly framed, nature-based solutions are supposed to be both, sort of addressing climate mitigation while being biodiversity friendly. I think that it could be a useful framing to change the kind of agriculture that Canada has previously focused on. And I should say, I do think, Canada's development funding has varied over time, and our work in Malawi has received Canadian government funding. So, and there are a number of NGOs operating in Canada that are increasingly using agroecology as an overarching frame.
Okay. Irvin Waller asks, what would you want Canada to propose on agroecology in Milan this week, I guess, and then Glasgow at COP26?
Well, it's fun to imagine having influence in that sphere, but I would want them to commit to funding agroecological development projects and research in agroecology. I don't think they have committed to that in any way. And I think most importantly, commit to reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. I can't not mention that, having just spent 3 years working on the IPCC report on impacts of vulnerability and adaptation. It's crucial that Canada takes seriously its need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Okay,
there's no more questions in the queue, but so that allows me to cycle back to another question I have. You've touched on gender inequities several times during your remarks. It's true that women produce 70 or 80% of the food consumed in agricultural households, yet their ownership and access rights to land are frail at best. How can women's access to land and their rights of land ownership be strengthened? And what, if anything, can donors do to help strengthen those rights?
I think it's a really crucial dimension of addressing inequities in the food system, not just in terms of access to land and control over land, but training, seeds, leadership opportunities. All of those areas are deeply inequitable. And alongside that, the kind of ongoing inequity within households, which prevent women often from taking on leadership roles or engaging in some of these capacity building opportunities. So, we've been involved in approaches around addressing gender that are really kind of participatory, involving communities, being sensitive to their kind of cultural norms, and having them take the lead in addressing gender inequity. So a range of different strategies, whether it's small group discussions or use of theater or one-on-one discussions. Some of my PhD students are currently looking at gender transformative approaches to agriculture, which kind of it really engage men in conversations about addressing gender inequity. So I think those have really exciting promise. And I know that I had a meeting with a Canadian NGO that used to be called USC, and I think they're called Seeds of Change now. And they're using a sort of feminist agroecology approach with some of these features. But alongside those kind of community-based strategies, tackling questions, legal questions around domestic violence, around access to land is important. And that means likely involving civil society actors. So the project that the Seeds of Change organization is launching is combining kind of feminist organizations that are advocating for those kinds of legal changes for gender rights, combined with these kind of community-based strategies for addressing gender inequities within households, decision-making, division of labor, that sort of thing. So I think it's a multi-pronged approach, and I think Canada can engage with local organizations that are really advocating for those changes and have them take the lead. And I think that is already happening to some extent from my conversation with Seeds of Change. I hope that's their new name, USC. That there's increasing support for that from the Canadian government. So I think that's exciting. I think, really linking gender equity and other forms of social inequity to addressing food systems is really important if you're going to see benefits in terms of food security and nutrition and social benefits.
Okay, there's been a bit of chatter among the participants in the audience about who else is involved in this work. John Van Mossel mentioned Seeds Canada, as you have, but also the Food Grains Bank and its members, Farm Radio International, and at the policy level, the Food Security Policy Group. And Tim Broadhead mentions the Etc. Group, Pat Mooney's former organization. So that seems to bring us to the end of our list of questions, unless I see any latecomers, no. So permit me to thank you, Rachel, warmly for this fantastic presentation and for giving us a lot of ideas to take forward, not only agroecology, but related issues and struggles around biodiversity, inequity, food security, and so forth. So thank you for all of that, and I hope we can call upon you again at some time to enlighten us some more on how the struggle is going.
Thanks very much. I really appreciated the invitation and great questions. So good to have the discussion.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.